Oh, you know what browser?
Yeah, it's all done.
Minimize that camera. The little arrow on the top left. Left.
And then he's just going to share stuff.
And when I go on, these will move to the top of the box?
We can move them wherever you want.
Just put them, grab?
Yep.
Let's keep them up. Well,
Move the little quarter to the bottom so you can see it at all. Yeah, like that. Yep.
You don't need to see, you don't want to lose. Good.
good, thank you.
No problem.
Explain how the flip devices work. Yeah.
All right, good afternoon. We're missing two.
One is in the balcony, the other one is on her way. She's right now. Angela's, yeah. Angela's.
Very good. Full house. The way it's supposed to be. You all know how many absences you're allowed in this class, right? It is two. The third absence is an automatic failure. So I guess it's a good thing I reminded you. Especially those of you that thought you get 6 absences in a 12-day class.
We were kidding.
Oh, great. I love sense of humor. Good. Apparently I was slow on the pickup. We'll wait a minute for the last 2, and then we'll kick it off. While we're waiting, you can be thinking if you've come across anything of interest from our food world you want to share with the class. Hopefully at some point, as you're doing your readings and maybe looking for some outside sources, you'll have something to talk about in the realm of sustainability. Anybody bring anything of interest to class? Anything they've learned, seen, read, observed relative to our industry that we ought to go ahead, please. interesting. Actually, I'm not aware of that. So I certainly am aware of bacteria that has the ability to break down essentially the fossil fuel component of plastic. Well, that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? So basically, that's taking waste, it's repurposing it for utility. In other words, we grow mushrooms, and then of course it feeds right back into a food system. That's a great thing. Again, not aware of that. I'll have to look into that. Go ahead.
So one of the chefs I was talking to at the career fair told me he got his trout from a locally sourced river, where they cordoned off part of the river and were raising trout in there, and the trout were being sustained off.
Really interesting. Was that in the U.S. or from Canada? You know?
Yes.
It was from the U.S. I'm not really aware of that in public waterways.
I don't know, he didn't say where the water was.
I think he may have been kidding you. He may have had a couple of good fishermen that were marketing fish. That's a nice model. One of the problems with a model like that, since you're working in a natural setting, is if you overstock, if you don't use natural feeds. In other words, if you, like we do our animal proteins, if you bring feed in to the area, it kind of changes all the aquatic life, not just in the pen area, but because it's portable, it moves in the system. The other thing is, if we overload an area with fish, the fish waste itself can be problematic in the rest of the stream. But that's not a bad model. We're doing that in the oceans. Most of the new sustainable aquaculture, though, is done in closed pens where you have total control. And one of the reasons they do it is some of the fish that they're growing today have been domesticated to be not a native or wild strain, and you want to make sure they don't get out of the area and interfere with the native population in terms of reproduction. Yeah, a lot of interesting things going on. People are looking for better ways, and in fact, you should as chefs as well. That's what this class is about. One thing that I've been watching that's pretty interesting, we haven't done a unit on soil, but we did talk about organic last week, and I did tell you one of the great advantages of organic had to do with soil preservation. There is a big lobby going on to allow for organic certification for plants grown on substrate rather than real soil. And that's got a lot of people in the uproar. So in other words, if you're farming inside, if you're doing aquaponics, if you're doing vertical farming, you know, soil's heavy. You don't bring the soil, and you actually bring in some other substance that will hold the plant rooted, then you provide nutrient through alternative means. I don't think I would be in favor of that, but I think it's something that's going to go up here pretty quick. So, and again, for them to change the organic regulation, since it is essentially a law passed by our Congress, that regulation would have to be either rewritten or amended. Very good. So today, the purpose of today is production, like last week, but instead of talking about fruits, vegetables, commodity grains, we're going to talk about animal proteins. But before we do that, let's do a quick review. What were some of the issues associated with essentially industrial factory farming of our fruits and vegetables? What were some of the things we talked about? Go ahead.
Pollination.
Certainly pollination. I mean, the fact, and what precipitates having to bring in outside pollinators? In other words, having to truck in honeybees. Yep.
Giant monocultures.
Yeah, monoculture. A monoculture, again, single variety, single species, in fact, over a large area. Totally unnatural. There had never evolved that system, so as a consequence, there had never evolved a natural pollination strategy to deal with that. So monoculture is a huge issue. Another issue. Yeah, the soils in particular, since we're amending things like fertilizers, again, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and lots of pesticides, if we don't get them in the right amounts with water, whether it be irrigation or rainfall, those move into and they contaminate our waterways. So it's a huge issue associated. Other issues. Go ahead, please.
Soil nutrient value.
Yeah, so not just soil loss, but soil fertility. We're growing the same crops over and over on the soils. What's happening is we're extracting basically the same nutrient profile, and as a consequence, the soils are void of nutrient, and probably, and we'll do soil in another unit, but it's really the basic life that works with that organic matter, which essentially is plant residue, to create those nutrient profiles. Again, I wanted to remind you, just in terms of conceptually thinking about it, in terms of our natural world, everything is cyclic. And when we think of soil, food starts with soil and ends with soil, ideally. So it's kind of a soil-to-soil model. I think a much more apropos description of where we want to go than what we commonly talk about in terms of farm to table. We need to, again, understand organic designation for vegetable, fruit, and commodity grains. What did it tell you that the definition of it was, or a summary of the definition? 3 things. You ought to know it off the top of your heads. These are the type of things you're going to see in your next quiz. What do growers have to do to be certified organic?
No man-made fertilizers, no man-made pesticides, and no GMO seeds.
There you go. That easy. So they can't use genetically engineered seed. They can't use synthetic, which means man-made fertilizers or pesticides. Do organic growers, are organic growers able to use pesticides?
Yes.
Absolutely. But their pesticides, those are naturally occurring. Those are things that are already in nature. And then back to our discussion on genetic engineering, our quick discussion, just want to remind you the prevalence of it in commodity grains. We saw data that said virtually over 90% of soy, corn, cotton, all those items are virtually all genetically engineered today. All right, so let's talk about animal practices. You had 2 readings other than the introduction to the topic. How many of you have already read The Omnivore's Dilemma prior to this? Really, none of you. Very surprising. It was a popular book some number of years ago. Well, then, I would guess, since it was assigned, all of you read this chapter 11, right? And we will talk about that because it's really a new model for how things could be done, but also what it talks about is that the cyclic nature of our system. And then the certified humane standards, just to kind of give you an idea, that's a big area of awareness today, especially for young people, where they actually look at the care of our animals prior to their slaughter or prior to their use for human foods. All right, let's take a look at the PowerPoint. What was this a surprise for anyone? Anything on that chart that was surprising? In the introductory document, I gave you basically a statistic that on a per capita basis, the average American consumes about 200 pounds of animal product a year. And this is, pictorially, is the breakdown. There's obviously 2 significant trends here that we could talk about. Who wants to mention one of them?
Chicken's on the rise.
Chicken is on the rise. Significant. If we look back from 1950, it's about a 3x increase. Another observation?
Beef is on the low.
Yeah. So beef, from the peak in the mid-70s, has reduced about 18%. And as we go through the class, and even today, we'll look at some of the consequences associated with producing these. That's a good trend. We've done a lot here at the school with our menus of change to highlight the natural resources in support of production of beef. Chicken is much more efficient. When we look at natural resources in many areas, it's on the order of 10 times more efficient. So that's a good trade-off. What did you think about our consumption relative to other countries such as India that was in the introduction? And when you think globally, there's some stark differences, aren't there? 200 pounds per capita here in the U.S., in a country like India, under 10. So you always have to keep that in mind. Again, one of the big challenges in the world is, not India in particular, but countries like China have dramatically changed their consumption habits recently, and their beef graph is going up almost exponentially. So while one population cuts back, other populations increase. Turkey's about 17 pounds per capita, and a lot of it occurs this month. Pork, a little bit of growth, but basically a flat line. We looked at vegetable supply chains last week. Let's look at supply chain for broiler chickens. And again, if we're doing life cycle analysis, we start at the beginning and we finish at the end, which is either consumption or disposal. So this is broiler chicken, but it looks a lot like on the front end, it looks a lot like what we saw with commodity grains, right? So we start with soy, corn. Why is that part of the cycle? Anyone should be able to answer that. Where are we growing corn and soy if we're raising broilers? Yeah, that's what we're feeding them. And not only are we just feeding them corn and soy, what about this little box down here? Does this surprise you? Why the heck are we harvesting fish if we're raising chickens? We feed them that as well. In a commercial blend, really what we're doing is we're looking for an optimum level of protein, because all we care about in industrialized factory farming is feed conversion. In other words, out of every pound I feed an animal, I have an expected rate of return in that animal. And one of the ways with fast-growing things is to keep the protein up, and of course, fish are high in protein. So if we're doing life cycle analysis, we've got to start with basically the chicken that laid the egg that we hatched to start the broiler process. So it goes back really far. So we started the hatchery, we feed them, we produce them, then they're processed, retailed, prepared, consumed. Now the processing, let's break the processing down. Give me some examples of processing that you might see for chicken. Canned, yeah, the potted meat. So that'd be highly processed, but that's an example, certainly. I mean, a less intensive processing would simply be what? Yeah.
Cut it.
Yeah, basically just a slaughter and either sell a whole bird or quarter it, or half. Cut it in small pieces. Finally, again, it gets to the preparation, and again, our chicken consumption is about 80 pounds per person now. So a significant amount. And then after consumption, there's a box that's missing. What is that box? What happens with the foods after we consume it? Yeah, because we don't consume all of it. And we certainly don't eat chicken bones. So there are, some people don't eat chicken skin. So there are a number of elements that aren't used purposefully. So once again, we're going to think about life cycle analysis. And I just want to get you thinking in the context of every single one of those nodes. There are inputs and there are outputs. And ideally, we want to make the inputs more efficient, and we want to minimize the outputs that are extraneous, or an externality, like we talked about in day 4. So we can do the same thing here. Again, we can just look at a resource of water and go back. Where do you think we use a lot of water? Absolutely. So growing the corn and soy, water intensive, especially if it's in the areas of the Midwest where there's not a lot of rainfall and we're irrigating. While we're raising the poultry, they need a lot of water like any other animal, high water requirement. In production, there's a lot of water, mostly in sanitation and cleaning. Processing, really water intensive. Retailing, maybe not so much, but maybe in the home, if you're making a stew. So water across the whole cycle. In a little bit, we're going to look at some of the water requirements to produce a calorie of chicken. Here's an important term. Should be aware of it. How many people have heard of CAPOs? Well, now you all have. And again, as chefs, as people in our food industry, it's important you understand this. It is basically the factory farming model for today. Confined animal feeding operation. No longer are there many small. Today there are fewer large. Why did we trend in that direction?
Cheaper.
Okay, it creates a cheaper end product. And how does that come to be?
You can just mass produce. You don't have to, like, not every single farmer needs to have, like, the equipment at that point and use.
Well, in fact, again, following a factory model, what are we looking for? We're looking for maximum productivity with the lowest inputs, and that results in a low price. So the farmers that are operating CAPOs today, they are pretty significantly capitalized. There's a lot of money in there, but they are specialized. They have all the right equipment that allows them to do this very efficiently. So as a consequence, at the end of the production, when the animal goes to slaughter, they can be profitable with a relatively small margin. And if there is a good thing about the model today, it is what we've already talked about. Our food costs relative to our disposable income are at record lows. They're very insignificant. Again, I think that's a bad thing for two reasons. One, we aren't really monetizing all costs, so there are the externalities that we're not accounting for. And then the other thing is, it allows people to think food is cheap, and if something's cheap, you don't value it. And again, that's a relatively new phenomena, and I think we've got to get over that. It can't continue forever. So anyway, we're looking at a hog CAPO here, obviously. Here's a trend. There's some data from Iowa. And you can see a major increase since the mid-90s. Today, the majority of operations have over 5,000 hogs. I mean, I think if you go back into the 80s, there were not even 5 that were that size. So we've scaled significantly. And of course, by scaling, they can take advantage of that factory model. We kind of see the same problem here, though, that we saw in vegetable production. Once people get into this role, there are basically barriers to entry for changing their business because they're so specialized and invested a lot of equipment. For example, if you thought it would be better to raise broiler chickens, you'd have to start all over again. Your buildings aren't the same, your equipment's not the same, maybe the feeds that you produce are not the same. So it's really challenging. But we're seeing a lot of growth in all animal production. And I mean, there we go back. Here's some specific numbers. Number of farms, dramatic increase. And this is just through 2007. This trend has continued. Let me ask this. Do you think the increase in farm size and the increase in the number of animals produced, has that precipitated the awareness of animal welfare? What do you think? And animal welfare, I didn't hear about when I was your age. It's kind of a big deal today. Do you think farm size, number of animals produced, has a direct relationship with the awareness today? Anyone think it doesn't?
I think the quality's gotten worse as they began to produce these animals on a larger scale with not enough room.
Well, that's separate. I'll come back to it because that's interesting. But just in the context of animal welfare, can anybody make the argument? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I think people are just more aware because like people will work for these big companies and then it like gets out that like videos of like inhumane like practices and then like it kind of goes viral. Because they're like large companies that like a lot of people buy from.
Well, they aren't always large companies. I mean, a lot of these 5,000 hog farms are family farms. But fundamentally, do you think you can give an animal the attention and the care, the husbandry? Remember the term from early on? If you've got 10,000 pigs versus 100, heck, if you have 100 of them, you might name them. If you're so inclined, I mean, you know you're going to slaughter them in 5 months, right? And that's the cycle, by the way, with hogs, right? They get a litter of hogs, day old, 5 months later, their live weight 230, 240 pounds, and off to the slaughterhouse. That's how quick. So talk about feed conversion. That's a pretty good turnaround. Think about a human. You probably, a lot of you will never get to 240 pounds, which is good for you. But you know, it's going to be 15, 18, 20 years in a human, but a hog in a relatively short time, 5 months. Okay, back to your quality. Tell me what made you think of that. I mean, is it something you observed firsthand, something you've read? Because I think there is something to it.
Well, early, a long time ago, there wasn't these huge mass-producing farm machines that had to keep pigs in a 3x3.
Right, very little space to the animals. Why do you have little space?
Because the high demand for it.
Well, there's high demand for space, but the other thing is, remember, we want good feed conversion ratios, right? So if I let the pigs wander and move around a lot, what are they going to do? They're going to burn calories, right? I don't want them burning calories. I want them putting on weight. What I think you hit on relative to quality is this, and we'll talk a little bit about it here, and then we'll also talk about it when we do biodiversity. You know, we have domesticated these animals, and we have controlled through artificial selection the characteristics that we look for in these animals. And in doing that, they are certainly very uniform, but some people might say they're a little bland compared to. And we see a lot with hogs. I mean, if you've worked with any chefs today, you know, it's the Mulefoot, it's the Berkshire. People are really high in the Magalisa. They're looking for a lot of these heritage animals because the character of the meats are very different. They're not uniform, and they can exploit that. So we have not only factory farms, but we have great uniformity. And when you discuss quality, certainly where flavor or fat content, things like that can all play into it. And there we are, getting ready for November. Pretty close quarters, huh? Do you think that's healthy, having them that close? What do you think you might have to worry about? Yeah, disease. There is no question. Disease is a huge issue. In CAPOs, it's managed how? How do we manage disease? Yeah, antibiotic. But we don't wait till they're sick because we know they're going to get sick. And if they get sick, what happens? It's just like when you're sick. You go off, well, you're potentially contagious, but you go off your feed. And then you're not getting a good feed conversion for a couple of days. And then at, the 8-week period or whatever you're planning on raising broiler chickens, about 8 weeks, now all of a sudden you got 90% at, 7-pound live weight, and you got a 10%, maybe as low as 5 because they were sick. So they're on antibiotic all times, preventatively. Go ahead.
Yeah, my dad's friends were doing some work for a chicken farm.
Yep.
And when they were to go into the farm, they literally sprayed, they de-infected their entire truck and everything before they could go in.
Yeah.
And then if there's if a chicken gets out, they have to kill it. If it's out of their caged area where that was, because it's contaminated now.
Yeah, so they do an awful lot to try to control bring in any kind of bacteria, any kind of virus, any kind of disease. And it kind of works both ways. Unfortunately, there are a number of diseases, viruses in particular, that can cross species from birds to people as well as hogs to people. And they are very, very dangerous should they happen. So yeah, these big farms, there's a lot of decontamination. In fact, 2 years ago, I wanted to go visit our primary farm here where we get our eggs from, and because of a bird virus, the USDA basically supported farms not allowing any visitors on site, no matter what decontamination efforts they took. Here's the same thing with cattle. Because of the amount of cattle, because of the size, it is a confined animal feeding operation. Typically, these are outside of buildings, with the exceptions of our huge dairy. And these are big, these are your basic stockyards. And it is generally the last phase of production. That's where they're finishing off these animals with a specific ration. So confined animal feed operation, it's just, it's the nature of it. It's how our animals are produced today. So are there any positives? Well, again, the low unit cost, something that we all see. But they are specialized, they are high yielding. To lower their costs, they have to be somewhat efficient, so they maximize resources. Sometimes it's just structural, like setting up your CAFO close to where the feeds are processed, close to where it's going to be slaughtered, close to a transportation hub. It wouldn't make sense to be really big and have to not have those things close by. So basically, just like our vegetable production model, it follows an industrial factory model. Let's talk about these negatives. We hit on antibiotic a little bit already. Not only in isolated cases are some of these viruses associated with animals, and again, in particular birds and hogs, but much of the bacterial infections can cross species as well. So what does that mean? It means that we're feeding these animals and CAFOs the same antibiotic that we're giving people. What's the potential problem with that long term? Go ahead.
Antibiotic resistance.
Yeah, antibiotic resistance. Any living thing has genetic variability, and over time, the traits that are less controlled, the bacteria, at least by the antibiotic, they build up. Little by little, you've lost the ability of the antibiotic to work. That has huge consequences in medical profession. What are we doing all the time? We're always looking for new antibiotics to replace ones that we have basically used for a length of time, and bacteria have become resistant. How about hormones? What do hormones do? Good.
Yeah, that's growth.
They do. They work with the endocrine system, and hormones can promote growth. Remember, if your business is raising animals, the faster the growth, the better the growth, the more uniform the growth, the better off you are. Hormones are used, have been used through all animal proteins. They are no longer allowed in poultry. There are significant reductions across the board, especially in pork. But there are some workarounds. In pork today, because they're using a lot less of the standard hormones, they're using other things like beta antagonists. In the U.S., there is a compound called ractopamine. Very few people are aware of it. We're virtually the only country in the world that uses it. It's been banned in every other country, and it is very common in our hog production, the beta antagonists. So we use a lot of inputs to maximize production. I mean, animals, no matter where you raise them, there's going to be a lot of waste. It's just the nature of the system, right? Why do I say it's more of an issue in the CAFO? I need you to think, folks. Why would animal waste be something we'd be more concerned about in the concept of a confined animal feed operation? Say it? I guess possibly to a degree if you had poor management, but no, it's more than that. Go ahead, Angel.
Because it can, put like too much nutrients into the soil.
You're on the right path. She said because it would put too much nutrient, overload soil with nutrient, so that she's in the right.
So the runoff will.
Well, runoff is a huge issue, but go ahead.
The effects of these chemicals that have to do with antibiotics, and for example, with pigs, I know that they add a lot of phosphorus to other waste.
They do, as human waste, all waste, but pigs in particular. Yep. Well, think about it. And what's the title of a CAFO? What is the first word? Confined. So what does that mean then? What about the waste? Yeah, it's consolidated into a single area. And to use it properly, you would have to take it and distribute it, ideally back to where those grains were grown. That's the natural cycle. Do you think that happens? Of course not. It's mostly water, it's heavy. We're not making use of the waste. It no longer is a natural resource, it's more of a problem. So waste removal, in particular, how we can efficiently utilize it, is a challenge. What about air pollution? Yeah, the urea from the urine of the animals, a lot of ammonia. If you have them in a tight, close place, there's significant air issues. There's also air issues based on the fact that most of our animals are fed grains. The process of growing grains puts a lot more nitrogen in different forms in the air than if they were grass-fed. Water pollution, that's the runoff. It can be from animal waste. It can be just from poor feeding. And then you have all the animal welfare issues that people are concerned about. It's funny, I never paid a lot of attention to animal welfare issues, maybe because I was a farmer and I've raised lots of animals and I've visited a lot of farms. I mean, farmers truly respect and love their animals, even if you got 10,000 pigs, because they're your, that's how you make your money. But we do things very differently than we used to. And, and everyone would agree that in nature, there's no such thing as an animal that doesn't move more than a meter from the time it's born to the time it's slaughtered, right? I mean, it just doesn't exist, and that's basically the model today. But again, if there's a strong element to animal welfare, it's that it's something that people can sympathize with. They pick up on really quickly, even people that aren't especially educated in the broad topic that I want to cover here in this class. It connects with them. And there are a lot of studies that say animal welfare is the largest factor driving alternative diets like veganism, vegetarianism, things like that. So, and because eating more plants is better for the environment, I would say animal welfare is kind of in a roundabout way creating some good change. Anybody here vegetarian or vegan? Good. It's hard to be in a culinary school when you're learning and you got to try these things. Of course, you want to taste your foods. How many, does anybody here really, outside of looking at the diet from a nutrition point of view, is anybody here conscientiously reducing their animal protein intake? Well, if this course is over, you're still not, I will have failed. And you, if I know you were going to do that, you will have failed the class as well, but I guess I won't know that for sure. Okay. I mean, even myself, I certainly have changed my eating based on what I understand now. It's not that I don't eat beef. I do eat beef. I eat it less, and often when I eat it, I feel a little bit guilty. That's a positive change, I would say. Okay, here's a chart or statistic. 80% of all antibiotic use is in animals on farms. So when we think about antibiotic resistance, now we know where it's coming from, huh? 80% all antibiotic use on farms. And again, the reason is these animals are on antibiotic from the day they're born to about 2 weeks before they're slaughtered. You can't have detectable antibiotic at slaughter. The USDA and their process basically looks for those things. So, I mean, it's just huge. Let's talk about the hormones, in particular anabolic steroids, muscle growth and development. We see it low level, beef cattle, dairy cattle, hogs. It is strictly prohibited today in poultry. Do you know these steroids have the same function in people? And do you know there have been lots of studies that show the same thing here, that we have more muscle growth, faster development, especially sexual maturity, than we did otherwise because we're picking up these through our animal protein consumption? I mean, so again, just awareness over time, government policy, the USDA controls this with regulations, we're changing. This is a little busy, but really what we're looking at here is we're looking at atmospheric ammonium ion concentration and at different times. And you can see the increase largely in our Midwest. It's a function not only of intensive crop production, but it's also indicative of what we're seeing with our CAFOs, especially the stockyards and hog raising. So it's been increasing significantly. And one thing that I note is it shifted, it's got a bias, it shifts towards the East Coast, and that's a function of the prevailing weather patterns. So people downstream from it basically are bearing the brunt. There's been a ton of consolidation in the processing of our animal proteins. 4 firms only, so 4 companies in 1980 controlled relatively significant amounts, but less than half, of hog, chicken, and beef. Take a look today. Beef, 85% of all beef runs through 4 corporations. Now you've learned about, in other classes, just basically economics, what's one of the things you worry about if you have very few people in a market? Yeah.
That's called monopoly.
See it?
Monopoly.
Yeah, monopoly. And what that really means is they have undue control. There is no one to compete with them. So there is a lot of concern. In reality, to date, I don't think they have abused that, but it's just not a good sign. We wouldn't allow it in other areas. And here's a chart that just shows market control. And for the categories of steers, heifers, cows, bulls, pigs, sheep, and lamb, across the board, if we look now at 2012, well more than 50% of all those animal proteins are controlled by only 4 companies. And what we are starting to see in terms of a change, if you look at the total value, it's been basically flat. So they are not inflating prices. They are not trying to take more profit out of the market at this point in time, but it's always a risk. We talked about greenhouse gases here before. We defined externality. I asked you last week what a good definition of externality is. I'll ask you again today. What is the definition of an externality? I'm using the term a lot. I'm going to use it every week. How did I define externality? Please.
Cost not accounted for?
A cost not accounted for but in fact, the true cost that is shared by all. That's an externality. And we can fit greenhouse gas into that category. And here, if you just look across some common agriculture, you can see the big hitters have to do with animal protein. As much as 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture come from these two areas. So this is manure that isn't managed well in pastures, so that's a consequence of CAFOs. And this box here says enteric fermentation. That would be ruminants. Those are animals with multi-chambered stomachs. And the reason they give off a lot of greenhouse gases is because the digestion is done with bacteria. And bacteria in the stomach works in the absence of oxygen, so you can't create oxygen-based compounds. You have to create, basically, in this case, hydrogen-based compounds. You know, I look at data all the time, and this is a really solid data set. It's from the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. It's as recent as 2014, but this particular one here, where they talk about the burning of savannas and the impact that has on greenhouse gas, I've seen that number almost 20% in other data sets. So we're still having trouble getting our arms around the real contributing factors. That's pretty high variability. Why are they burning savannas? In agriculture, yeah. Yeah, they need more land. And what do you do if you need more land? You clear the land. And in a lot of developing countries, fire is the fastest way to do it. This is some really good data. Did everybody go through it and understand it? Or are you going to need some help? Now, folks, just because you look at something and it isn't real crystal clear in 5 seconds, doesn't mean you should ignore it. If it took you a half hour to understand this, it would have been worth it. This is some really good data. This data, in fact, this exact report that generated this was a major input into our last review by the USDA and Health and Human Services on our, in 2015, with respect to our food recommendations, you know, the MyPlate. They somewhat ignored the data, and we can talk about that. Well, okay, one of the observations here clearly would have been, if you look at the red line, is that beef's a problem. Did anybody see in the new MyPlate that they significantly said to reduce beef? They didn't at all, no. Reduce your animal protein and increase your vegetable component, but they didn't really pick on beef. So any guesses why, if the data was this conclusive, why they wouldn't have? It's a huge industry. And remember, these are U.S. Nutrition recommendations. They are, you know, they're formal. They are required by an act of Congress. Do you think a beef grower in Nebraska or Texas, the senator from that state's going to be real happy if our Congress says no more, you know, reduce beef by half? Of course not. So it all ties together. Remember when I defined sustainability, we looked at the 3 pillars, and I said the challenge is they're all related. There's a real good case where the social or policy piece, the governance, is impacting a good environmental decision. All right, let me help you out with this chart. Basically, what we're looking at is the amount of natural resources needed, in this case, to produce 1,000 calories. So about half of your daily diet. We look at the resources of land, irrigated water, greenhouse gas, reactive nitrogen, and we look at the animal proteins of dairy, beef, poultry, pork, and eggs. So it's kind of interesting because you can do a ready comparison. So if I look at land, again, to produce 1,000 calories, I use 147 units of land. In this case, those are square meters. Whereas eggs, it's about 3.5. That's almost 100 times increase. So in other words, to get 1,000 calories, or even to get 1 calorie, you can look at any scale that's independent. Basically, it takes land about 1,000 times more land to get a protein from beef than it does eggs. Or 100 times, I'm sorry. Irrigated water, same thing. One thing this chart does that's really interesting is if you look up here at the top, it contrasts them to some important crops: potato, rice, and wheat. Basically, across the world, as much as 70% of all plant calories come from, not potato, it comes from wheat, corn, and soy. So potato, rice, and wheat. And you can see in the case of land, you know, truly much lower. Potato and rice, less than 1 relative to 147. So animal proteins are land intensive. Now let's look at water. Well, certainly we need a lot of water. This is in cubic meters. So this is 60 times 30, 1,800 gallons of water, basically, to produce 1,000 calories. And we look here, beef 1.6, everything else is under a half. So 3, 4, 5x increase. In general, the rule of thumb I want you to remember is beef for most natural resources is about 10 times the resource intensive as your other animal proteins and about 100 times more resource intensive than a plant protein or a plant calorie. You can cut it either way. Greenhouse gas is another horrible story. Reactive nitrogen. So you look across the board and beef really stands out. In fact, this number, to make the graph work, they have to shorten it, but the beef here for reactive nitrogen is 176 versus on the order of 20 or 30 for most of these. So it's a big difference. It looks like it's only twice as much, but no, it's 8 times as much. And then just a reminder, where are we getting our calories? Well, we're getting 30% of our calories from animal proteins in our diet, 70% from plants. Again, I've given you a statistic that of those 70% calories from plants, half of them are fats, oils, and sugars. Most of our calories come from dairy. Even though we eat more chicken, remember, we eat 80 pounds of chicken and only, 70 pounds of beef, we still get more calories from the beef than we do from the poultry. Pretty interesting data, you think? You're welcome after class to go back to your room and look at this carefully and bring some questions next week. I think and in fact, I've had students in previous classes that actually wanted the research paper this data came from. It's a great paper, published by the National Academy of Science. Did anybody play around with this factory farm map? Maybe take it a second to load. What's going on here? Close this. Try it one more time. Did I click on the right thing? I'm not sure what's going on here. Pretty cool tool. I looked at it yesterday, so I know it worked. Not sure why it's not working now. Did anyone try it at all? Did it not work for you if you tried it, or?
It didn't work on my Mac.
It didn't?
On my Mac, yeah.
On your Mac, it did not work. Let me put that here. Get this damn thing out of the way. Cut that off. I don't know if it's a function of the fact that they're recording everything I do here, which is annoying the shit out of me. But I don't have this problem in the other classes. All right, so we won't do that. Kind of cool, it lets you look across a period of 10 years, and you can look at the growth in animal production, and most important, where it occurs in the country. And the big takeaway, I'll just tell you, and we'll talk more about it when we do water, but, you know, like 80% of the animal protein, with the exception of poultry, is in the central U.S. And remember, that's an area where we have to pump water. We don't get enough rainfall. So it won't continue forever. At some point, that statistic will no longer be the case. That's potentially challenging. Ton of facts. I'm not going to read them. You can read them. But the point of making these available for you is to let you really comprehend the scale of our agricultural system. Also, I've given you some links if you want to do any research on your own. And for anything, you can do it for any fruit or vegetable. We'll look at broiler versus layer. So this is from the USDA's Economic Research Service. Before I go too far into it, can anybody fathom a guess of how many broilers we raise here in the U.S. on a yearly basis?
4 million.
You said 4 million?
Yeah.
Well, let me help you. There's 330 plus million people, and we know we eat over 70 pounds. So 4 million is going to be low. Close enough. You're within an order of magnitude. Yeah, it's between 7 to 9 billion. We raise that many chickens. In terms of vertebrates on the planet, chickens are right at the top. There are the number one vertebrate is a fish, the number two is a salamander. Chickens are coming really strong, right close to a number 3, because we produce so many for our consumption. What's that? They're there. You got to just lift up a rock or kick over a log. They're out there. So there's some really good graphs, really good data sets in here. But here's where we talk about number produced, and by state. So it shows where they're produced. In the United States, 8.7 billion broilers. And at any point in time, there's not 9 billion. Remember, we're raising them over a 5-6 week period. Then we slaughter, then we do it again and again. So through the course of a year, about 9 billion birds. It's a lot of birds, folks. A lot of things popped up here. Page not found. I guess I clicked on it a million times. If one of them says page found, let me know. Not found. let's look at layers. First question, do you think we have more layers than broilers? No, we don't need more layers than broilers, right? Because we're not slaughtering them every 5 weeks or every 50 days. Any guesses? Well, I can tell you there's basically a layer out there for each one of us. There's about a layer for every person in America on some farm laying eggs for us. No, just in the U.S. So 340 million type of thing. Within the U.S., the U.S. number. Across the planet, it would be nice if we had 7 billion layers so that everybody could have the same access to eggs that we have, but they don't. What do you think we do with, and here we are here again, 365,000. This is per 1,000 layers, so it's 365 million birds. Kind of interesting if you look at the states. Iowa surprised me. Oh, no, it was very different. The distribution is very different if you look at which states grow broilers versus which states grow layers. So again, there's a lot of data here, and there's lots of pages. You can cut it a million different ways. It's kind of interesting. So we have good data. The government does a really good job of understanding things. It's just a matter of, does anybody ever take the time to look at it? More facts. And guess how many cows there are in the U.S.? We can do the same thing. Think there's more cows than chickens? Definitely not. We do export beef more than, well, we export some chicken too, but more beef. And we import beef, about 30 million. In fact, because they're larger than us, there's actually more biomass in beef and cows in the U.S. than there are biomass in people. In other words, if you had to scale and put all the cows on one side of people, on the other side the cows would win. Just one interesting thing, at least I think it's interesting, it needs some development, but there was more biomass of buffalo in the 1700s or 1600s than there is beef or people in the U.S. And we didn't seem to have all the problems with greenhouse gases and things we had today because they weren't confined. They were part of a natural system. Okay, so there are some production alternatives. Instead of CAFOs, we can do smart pasture operations. So instead of massive, how about mid-size? Instead of really crowded, provide them more space. Instead of feeding them a very specific diet that has to be farmed intensively, cattle are ruminants. They're supposed to eat grass. That's how they evolved. Put them on pasture. Instead of shipping feed in, have the feed much more closer to the site of raising the animal. Integrate it in terms of a diversified farm with crop farming. And take advantage of the manure. That's a natural resource. Put it back in the ground where the food came from and restore the fertility. So there are some really good solutions. So we talked about organic fruits and vegetables. Now we'll talk about organic animal proteins. The first step is you got to feed them more organic grains. The second step says you can't use any of the inputs. You can't use antibiotics. You can't use hormones. And the last piece says they must have access to the outer doors. So there is no restricted, confined CAFOs in an organic setting. They still can be really intensive, but the animals all have access to the out of doors. You've heard the term free range. See that on a lot of menus. I don't think I've had a chicken in a restaurant in 10 years that didn't say free range somewhere on the menu before it said chicken. Why is that a big deal? Go ahead.
Doesn't free range just have to do with the amount of sunlight that you
Yeah, it's kind of meaningless. Technically, and free range, I don't think is a USDA designation. Cage-free is, but free range isn't. It's more along the lines of the animal welfare organizations, but it simply says they have to have access to the outdoors. It doesn't mean they go outdoors. You have to have a door open, for example. Some of them may never go out. But it is a step in the right direction. And of course, if you're working with a lot of local producers, heck, and they say it's free range, you can go visit them and see what they're doing. And here in the Hudson Valley, there's a lot of good producers, a lot of fowl available. A lot of them use this concept of the chicken tractor. I think they talked about it in your reading with Michael Pollan. You basically just have a little building on wheels. That's where the chickens go at night. And when they go in at night, you move them to a new place and let them out so they're always moving through. And they're basically limited feed. They're eating the grasses, they're eating the insects, they're eating, in Michael Pollan's case, they're recycling the waste from the other animals, rabbits, pigs, beef, and that's where they're getting their food from. I gave you a chance to look at a couple of the certifications here. Anybody want to look at them? Did anybody look at one? Have any questions? In poultry, again, cage-free, access to out of doors. It is an actual grading standard for eggs. So eggs, like I said, eggs can be, anything can be graded, doesn't have to be, even eggs don't have to be. I told, when I gave you the definition for grading and I said it's voluntary, I know some of you were probably confused with animal proteins. And the difference is they have to be inspected. Eggs don't even have to be inspected. I mean, right now you can go down into the West Village and go to a little bistro for breakfast, and they've got a chicken coop on the roof. And they just bring the eggs right down, right on your plate. Omelet from an egg, laid that morning. There is no interference by anybody in that process. You're allowed to do that. One thing with respect to cage-free, there is a lot of interest, again, from consumers. So there's a lot of push, and people will pay a price differential for a cage-free egg. What I find interesting is from a policy discussion, there are cities or states that have legislated cage-free only use eggs in those territories. What do you think about that? Is that something we should be doing with governance? There's not a right answer, folks. In fact, you're going to be in charge someday, so you guys are the ones that are going to make these decisions. Should we be legislating animal welfare? I don't know. I think we're going to see it, because you see it right now. I mean, the state of California had a referendum, and the voters agreed that they should only eat cage-free eggs in California. So that's basically what drives, in a lot of areas, that's what drives policy. They made a little bit of a mistake, though, didn't they? You aware of the issue in California with cage-free eggs? California uses about 5 times the number of cage-free eggs produced. So unless they're going to cut their egg consumption down to 20%, they're not going to have cage-free eggs. They didn't bother to do the math. Let me ask this, from an environmental point of view, certainly from an animal welfare, a social perspective, cage-free is a nice thing. Do you think it's a good thing for our environment as well? Well, that would be the question. And if I went to cage-free, how would it help the environment? Or maybe would it hurt the environment?
Right, I feel like, I don't know enough about it, but I feel like it doesn't make a difference, or is that really gonna be, cause with cows, you can use their manure to help with a lot of things, do chicken.
Same thing, you want, the waste, the animal waste manure is a great resource you want to use it productively. So, we have the same issue with a chicken CAFO, all the manure is localized, we are distributing it, so But if you're cage-free, the definition of cage-free basically says that the animal has about 3 times the space of the cage. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not gonna have that problem. Go ahead.
Well, I went to, one farm that was rotation, so they had the cows in one pasture, and then they all fed up with the chickens at one point. So the chickens would follow and they'd pick up the, like bugs that would hurt.
Fly larvae in the waste.
At the same time, they would fertilize.
And they would scratch the manure, which are in the, the piles, and integrate it into the soil so it would compost and decompose really quickly.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really nice model. I think the problem I see with something like cage-free eggs is, remember, if I gotta give them 3 times the space, in our factory model, which we're not gonna change overnight, we're still gonna house them. What does that mean then? The buildings are what? 3 times as big. And it takes, there's a lot of natural resources putting a building out, right? So, in that case, there may be, from the environmental point of view, this could be potentially, and you have to, do a life cycle analysis, you have to look at it very critically. But I believe some of these initiatives actually will be bad for the environment. But that's the trade-off we'll always make with sustainability. Whatever one of those pillars is most important to you is the one that you're gonna care most about. But remember, a decision you make in one might have negative consequences in the other. In terms of animal proteins, there's a lot of other labeling that you're seeing these days. And you just have to be aware that natural, farm fresh, local, the special designation on the bottom, they're all about marketing. They aren't legal definitions. They're not meaningful. So if you see natural anything, you can put natural anything you want. And it's meaningless. So there is a lot of confusion. Now, as a chef, it'd be pretty good not to be confused. I mean, this is your area of expertise. So you need to, over time, get underneath the cover on some of these things and be conversant. The last piece we'll talk about is simply slaughter. Like animal welfare, slaughter has come to the consumer's forefront. And we really haven't changed slaughter since 1958 in terms of the USDA standards. I mean, basically, you're killing an animal. And that's what we do. We kill 9 billion chickens. We kill, over a 3-year period, 35 million cows. I don't have the number off the top of my head for pigs. And there's a lot of people that want that to be as humane as possible. And it isn't just the actual moment of slaughter, it's the time leading up to the slaughter. I mean, you truck the animals in, they're stressed, the pressure, you put them in a small area. A pig, for example, seems to know that that's where they're headed. They have a good nose, they are really intelligent, and it's very difficult. So there have been a lot of initiatives to make it much more, if you can call killing something benign, make it much more friendly. And that's an area that I think we're seeing a lot. In fact, a number of those animal certifications that I showed you, they do have specific requirements for how that animal must be slaughtered. Again, if you're interested in these things, you can just click on them, read about them. But it's just part of it's part of our animal protein consumption. We gotta break the animal down. How do people ever slaughter an animal? Fish, sure, fine. So you killed a fish and you've got it in. It's the same thing. It's just most people say fish don't have feelings, but they do, just like any other animal. Yeah, I mean, it's 150 years ago, every family. That's except for the people that still were in the built centers of cities. I mean, you slaughter for dinner. Where'd your chicken come from? It's in the barnyard. You had to walk out, wring its neck, pull its feathers off, take its entrails out. And they were efficient. They didn't, how many people eat gizzards, the heart, the liver of the chickens when they come? They're packaged in a lot. You should, it's part of the animal. And back then, of course, they didn't waste anything. It was precious. Today, not so much. All right, let's talk about some of the readings. I'm really surprised that you have not read this book. We certainly have copies in the library. Omnivore's Dilemma. And here's just an interaction with Michael Pollan and time spent on a farm called Polyface in the Shenandoahs of Virginia, run by a farmer named Joel Salatin. There's lots of videos on YouTube. There's lots of news stories about this individual, Joel Salatin. In fact, his model was so innovative that Harvard Business School actually teaches a case study on Polyface Farm. But basically, he's trying to emulate nature. And everything is integrated. So he grows plants and he raises animals. But they all are in an integrated cycle. And his overall objective is not to import nutrient into this farm system. He wants to create all this productivity naturally within the farm system. And that's a really good idea, because certainly our planet is a closed system, and what we've been doing is we've been trading off one area for other areas for a long time. So he's doing it on a micro scale, and it's just really, really interesting. But, and again, if you have not read this, you should. If this is one chapter, this is not a book. It starts with the primary producer. It starts with grass. Grass grows from the sun, photosynthesis, and that's the base energy for the whole operation. And he does a really good job of explaining how he cycles through that. It's really innovative. He has been very successful. People flock from all over the world to visit his farm and his model. He's a kind of a showman, but there's a lot of science behind it. And he sells his everything on the farm. He sells for a really high premium. But people are willing to pay for things that are just like as a chef, if you're farm to table or you're doing your own charcuterie and stuff, you can charge more than the guy across the street because people are willing. There's just enough people with money that are willing to reward you for these unique behaviors, if you will. So it's really an interesting model, fairly impressive. All right, what questions did you bring to class? Told you to write it down, so it shouldn't be hard. Read the question you wrote down. How many questions then? Pass them to the center row. Told you day one, you need to have a question written down. You can hand it. Pens down. Pens down. Anybody do it? What's that?
I asked my questions during lecture.
Well, take your question, your written question.
What in writing?
No, I said, day one, the written question you prepared to hand in. You remember that? It looks bad for you. From a hard ass, you all lost the letter grade. It was worth 10 points. You're not very well prepared for this class. I mean, it's a new class. Maybe it's over your head. But these are really important issues. You're in a college setting. You're at a really good school. If you want to go somewhere in life, this is an area that can differentiate you from the average person out there in the industry. And like I said, there's enough people with a lot of money that are interested in the same area. So it's definitely an opportunity. And in fact, if you ignore it like everyone else, at the end of your career, you will have a very different choice. You won't be able to do the same things you did today. It's a fact. We're running out certain resources in certain areas, and you won't be able to have some basic things. I mean, we'll do biodiversity, you might not be able to have a good eating out of hand banana in 10 years based on what we're doing in our farm system. Does that surprise you? Banana, number 3 consumed fruit in the world. the Cavendish banana is likely to go extinct here in the next 10 years. And there isn't a replacement right now. There's another 1,000 types of bananas, but most of them have seeds. They aren't as sweet, they aren't as soft. They don't ripen as uniformly. These are the things. So that's what this class is about. I will expect next class that you all have a question when you come in the classroom that you can hand in. If you did the readings, even this one article, there would have been a lot of things probably not clear to you, since none of you have farmed before. What's the problem here at school? Too much work?
I don't think it's that. Like, the information is super interesting, and I've talked to my students, and we all are interested in it. I think it's just, like, the way it's relayed, it's a lot of, like, hard facts, so it's hard to, like, properly consume it all. I mean, does that make sense?
But is your problem that it is a lot of data-driven, or because I don't expect you to know these data points, but I expect you to know relationships. For example, that beef takes 10 times more water, soil than any of the other animal proteins.
Okay, well, then I think that's that. I think it was just like a lot of us are trying to memorize the hard facts, because we don't necessarily know what information we should be retaining, so that is becoming overwhelming. But now that I know that it's much more like conceptual, it's like that's what we'll be looking for more.
Please.
I was just gonna say that, like, I think in, like, our kitchen classes, like, we're in meats right now, so, like, we've been really talking about, like, when we're breaking down an animal, like, how do we use all those, like, you know, products to, like, the best that we can. And I think, like, in my, like, personal opinion, I think that, like, just me respecting, like, the animal that I'm, like, working on, or, like, doing whatever I am with it, like, that's, like, just as important as, like, you know, being sustainable and, like,
But it's a piece of sustainability. I mean,
Yeah.
nose to tail, for example, if you use more of the animal. What did they tell you the slaughter ratio was on a steer in terms of live weight to hanging weight? Yeah, about 65%. So it says 35% of it's tossed. Actually, 35% of parts of that can be used, but there just isn't a need for it in our system. But there are opportunities to take that 35%. It's edible, most of it, and to do something productive with it. So these are the things I want you to think about. I had told you at the beginning that the purpose of this class is just kind of open your eyes to an area where I think we have not paid close attention. And here at the school, we haven't integrated enough into our curriculum. It's hopeful with this class at this point in time, it'll allow you to have these discussions in all your kitchens and other classes, because the chefs are largely interested. But they too learned the industry in a time when this wasn't in the forefront, because these were not issues 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. We have dramatically changed our world in the last 20 years. In fact, in the next 25 years, we're going to change it even more. Remember, we went from basically, when I was born, there were 3.5 billion people on the planet. I'll probably die with 10 billion people on the planet. That's one lifetime. That's pretty dramatic, wouldn't you think? So that's why these things are an issue now, and they never were before. Now, clearly, this class is different, and most of what you've taken so far is very applied, hands-on, specific. This is, I won't say it's theoretical, but it's more or less applied. It's not to say that you can't apply some of the things that I'm teaching you, like eating less beef, but you have to understand why you do things. So now, in the context of this class, you're getting that background motivation. Any other comments? You were saying, Angela?
Well, you asked us last week, because you just asked us, like, why are we not, like, being responsive?
I asked
not
the
being
two of you, yes.
And I feel like I haven't seen any, like, change in how the class has been conducted.
Well, that was last Thursday, and you said do some hands-on activities, is what you said.
Yeah. Something that's going to get people to break off into groups and generalize discussion, because of course you are, like, so knowledgeable, and it is, like, very important information, and it's not like it's going to be internalized by all of us until we're the ones that are really talking. The only real chance that we have for participation during class right now is just when you ask us questions as you're lecturing and as you're going through the readings.
Well, that's not true. You can raise your hand at any time, but I mean, your point was well taken. You wanted some hands-on group activities. Now that we went through a lecture today, we've got a couple minutes. Give me an idea of some activities we could have had today in the context of animal production. Go ahead, please.
Ideas for sustainable meat farming.
Ideas for sustainable meat farming. Okay, so we learned about CAPO, which is the model, and now what are some alternatives? And then tell me how you think that would have worked best. So I gave you like 10 minutes to sit in groups.
Yeah, and like, just talking about us being future chefs, like, forcing us to develop like a concept as chefs to like, and a sustainable concept, you know, like making us work together and like create this idea since we are the chefs of the future, like you keep saying.
And you definitely are.
Yeah.
Okay, hands up.
I mean, just giving us like some discussion questions for ourselves to kind of
Think about.
debate about and talk about ourselves so we can.
But if you did the readings, those questions, I mean, I work apparently very different than you folks. By reading that, there's a million discussions that come into my mind. Why would I have to give them to you if you did the actual readings? Go ahead.
I think maybe like you had like a lot of charts and stuff today. Like you could have maybe like, okay, this group will talk about this chart and like analyze it and like what does this mean to you?
Now tell me how, so I would assign that, because we have a class next week, I would assign that prior to the class, so you would have homework, or I would give you time in class to look?
Just like kind of like in class, just like show us like group one, you're gonna like talk about this one.
And you guys all somebody brings enough laptops that if I set you up in groups, somebody can pull it up and,
Yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
part of
we
the
all have
class, yeah,
laptops.
all of us would bring our laptops and like, if we broke up into.
well, you don't even all need to bring them, but I need 4 laptops. Are there 4 here today? One? Yeah, so. All right, next class, we're doing water. Do the readings. I do have a PowerPoint. There will be some graphs. Maybe I'll cut back on which PowerPoints I talk about, give you a chance on a group basis to look at a graph and try to present what the graph was about, or how it relates to you as a chef. I'm willing to do that if that's what works better for you. I mean, you're only the second class I've had in this. And believe it or not, you're slightly better than the first class I had in terms of your interaction. I'm feeling it out. And the class I taught previous to all you students was virtually everybody's favorite class. But it was a hands-on applied class. So this is different. This class is really more important. If you can start to grasp these things, comprehend the big picture, you folks will be very unique, and you will have a skill set that's high in demand, believe me. And that's all anybody can ask for. So it really is a huge opportunity for you. I mean, and I know that for a fact. I get all kinds of inquiries from the outside. So we'll see how the next class goes. And bring me a handwritten question, write a hand in. Very good. See you next Tuesday.